As I was saying, because of the time change and the confusion over last week's cancellation, we've got a number of people listening today that may show up later all embarrassed. I don't know, but we need to go ahead and get started. Our first thought for this morning is the power of your influence. The power of your influence.
Very little.
I'd like to, I'll never say that. I'd like to go around real quick. Name a person in your life that has had a major, powerful influence on your life, and I'll start. My mom. There's no question about it. My mother was a powerful influence in my life.
I think my father.
Your father?
Well, my parents, of course, but our pastor in Chapel Hill did make a difference.
Made a big difference?
Yeah.
Anybody else?
My mother.
Your
my
mother?
Grandma. One of my teachers.
Your grandmother, one of your teachers. Do you remember what she taught?
Is my mother.
First grade.
First grade.
Oh, wow.
Brian Fox.
Oh, now
Yeah.
come on, don't start
Kiss
that.
up, kiss up. Oh, you
I
Don't
don't
start.
I'd say my grandma, but mom's mom.
Flossie.
Yeah, my
You bet.
mom.
Grandma.
Grandmother?
Seems
My
like
grandma
everybody
and
here
parents.
has an
And your
influence
father?
on you.
See, we've all had at least one person, and we could probably all
No, I
sit
think we
here
have many persons
and
that
name
have
several
influenced our
others
lives, yeah.
that have been powerful influences in our life.
Chris is
and
not
I'd
gonna
be-
eat the rest of the time
I'd
with
be
Sarah,
willing to
but that's
bet you
okay.
that if you were able to go to those people
I
and
would
ask
do that
them
with you
about it,
too.
they might be quite surprised that they had that much influence on you.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, they related to you, they gave you advice, they had an influence on you, but I don't think most of us realize just how powerful our influence can be on other people. Well, our scripture lesson today is from Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16, and I'm going to take it kind of verse by verse. 13 says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled upon." If, as a Christian, we are not fulfilling our purpose as a Christian, then we're useless. We're on the way to disaster. We are meant to be a positive influence on people around us, bringing purity and joy to life. You know, people need to discover the radiance of the Christian faith. And the best way for us, for people to observe the joy of living, the sparkle and enthusiasm for life, is in the way Christian people behave. If not, then salt, okay, becomes of no use at all.
I agree with you that being a Christian helps you influence people, but there are people I know that are not Christians that have influenced my life immensely, one being my sister. So I have trouble with you, to influence, you gotta be a Christian, I think.
No, I didn't say you
Oh,
have to be
okay.
a Christian. I'm saying that as Christians, we are expected
Okay, all right.
to be as positive and joyful an influence on people as we can. And to carry that even further, you could probably also name at least one person in your life that had a very negative, very bad influence
Several.
on you, because see, it works
See,
the
let
other
me
way
get out
too.
my,
But as Christians, we are expected to be the salt, the spice, the flavoring to life.
At the church I go to, we keep a shaker of salt up near the altar. So that
As a
anybody who wants
reminder?
to, well, anybody who wants to drink communion sometimes takes salt, and they just share salt with one another.
Huh.
Well, that's a unique idea.
Well, salt was huge back then when those,
Oh, yeah.
that was written.
Oh, absolutely.
It
That's what I
was
was
hard to
hoping.
get too.
I think so.
And they had different grades. So if you could afford good salt, you're just like it is now. If you can afford it, everything's good. But sometimes the poor grades of salt would be hardly salty at all, so that's what the reference is.
Yeah, so I think we understand the meaning behind that, but I think maybe people then would even get a clearer message.
Yeah.
Salt was used to
than
preserve
we
food,
might.
so when they say have salt, it's saying don't let rot come inside of you.
That's true, because salt was not only a flavoring, but a preservative.
So you really stepped in it, didn't you, Bruce?
Yeah, no, that's okay, that's okay. Verses 14 and 15. "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." You know, Jesus said at one point in time, he said that he was the light of the world. Remember that quote? So, in commanding his disciples and followers to be a light unto the world, what he's telling them is he needs them to be like him. Okay? We should shine with the reflection of Jesus' light. In other words, Christianity is meant to be seen. It's not something you hide. It's something that you need to make visible to people all the time in all aspects of your life. As a light also is not only brings light into a dark corner, but it also serves as a guide, making the way clear for other people to follow and go. So as a Christian, we must of necessity be an example to other people, because that's the means by which we can best influence those around us. And then finally in verse 16, Jesus goes on to say, in the same way let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. It is intended that other people be able to see your good deeds. Not necessarily see you, but to see your good deeds. To appreciate the good things you've tried to accomplish and that you've done. A Christian should be able to exhibit a goodness that attracts others and influences them to do the same thing. And those good deeds ought to be always done in such a way as to draw attention to God, not to yourself. So, Jesus has made 3 different statements here that all have to do with how we should be influencing the people around us, the world around us. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about a very famous man who I'm sure you're all familiar with, Albert Schweitzer. He was undoubtedly one of the great men of recent history, I think. We would all agree with that. He was an intellectual giant. He was a physician, a prominent, bless you, a prominent Christian theologian. He was an often quoted author, a superb organist, and the world's foremost authority on Bach. Some would have said that Schweitzer had the world at his feet. He was a multi-talented, famous individual. But you all know what he did. When he was 30 years old, he renounced the promise of a great and prosperous European career to give his life to the immediate service of others, and he became a doctor in the jungles of Africa as a missionary. And he spent 40 years doing that. He built a hospital and a settlement on the Ogowe River in Africa with his own hands. He paid for medical supplies by giving organ recitals in places like Vienna and London and Paris. And in his lifetime, he was a crusader for world peace, and at one point he did win the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a very remarkable individual. But what I've told you so far doesn't really tell you the whole story. If you know anything about Schweitzer, you know that he revered life so completely that he would never even intentionally kill a bug. Life to him was absolutely precious. You know, every once in a while when I'm swatting at flies,
I have no problem with that.
or spraying poison on those little red ants that are all over the backyard, you know, I think of Schweitzer, I really do. Now, you know, I might shoo a mouse out of the garage
I'd kill it.
instead of, you know, snapping it in a snap trap.
Sorry.
I might even put a snake back in the desert if I found a snake in my backyard, but I'll tell you what, there's no way I'm going to get those little red ants get away. I'm going to kill those suckers. You know? Schweitzer revered life so much that he wouldn't even step on an ant. Editor and writer Norman Cousins made this comment about Schweitzer. The greatness of Schweitzer, indeed the essence of the man, was what others have done because of him. His power to be an example. That is the measure of the man. Well, now that's a pretty good quote. It's not so much what he had done, but what others have done because of him that made him so great. And that could well be the measure of any great person. It comes down to what we cause others to do, how we influence other people. And as I said before, you know, you can say the same thing of somebody who's been an evil influence too. You know, there are certainly enough examples in the world of decent people who were led astray by evil influences and were destroyed because of it. So there is certainly power in our example, and that begs the question, I wonder exactly what kind of an example I am. What do other people end up doing because of me? I'll give you one quick example that came to my mind while I was putting this lesson together. Hi, Jay. How are you, dear?
Well, I thought I was early today.
Good try, Shane. Good try.
You will notice that we reserved 2 seats for you.
I'm so sorry for being so late.
That's all right. An example that just popped into my head when I was writing this, a number of years ago, I was asked to teach a class at UNLV in school administration. And it was a master's level class. Had about 40, 45 students in this class. They were all hopefully studying to become school administrators, that kind of thing. And good heavens, bless you. And as I went through the class, I used a lot of real life examples, true experiences that I had had in school. Some of them are horror stories, really. And I used the example of a couple of lawsuits and, you know, things that were very true to life, very real kinds of things that school administrators are faced with and have to deal with and so on. Anyway, completed teaching the whole class, and at the very end, I asked each person in the class to write me a paragraph or two, a summary of what they thought of the class, what they got out of it, whatever they felt like saying. And you know, I didn't know what to expect exactly, but what happened was not what I expected at all. Of the 40-some kids and young people, they weren't kids, they were young people in that class, over half of them thanked me for discouraging them from ever going into administration. It blew me away. I mean, I thought, oh my gosh, but then you got me thinking about that, and you know what? Those people would never have made it anyway, if that's the case. I mean, they would have gone into administration blind and innocent and gotten killed, crucified, by the things that they had to face. So I ended up having this kind of an influence, which was totally unexpected as far as I was concerned. And by the way, the university never invited me to They were in the process of trying to build up their college of education. Oh well. Anyhow, a number of years ago, the University of Chicago wanted to honor Albert Schweitzer, and they brought him to America to award him an honorary degree from the university. There was a guy by the name of Dr. McGilford who was representing the university, and he went with a group of people to meet Schweitzer's train when it came into the station in Chicago. Well, they saw the great philosopher get off the train, they greeted him, they told him how happy they were to have him there to be with them and how thrilled they were that they would be able to honor him. And all of a sudden, Schweitzer disappeared. He slipped away, he was gone, they couldn't find him anywhere. And they looked and looked and looked everywhere, they couldn't find him. Finally, they did locate him. You won't believe what he was doing. He was carrying a suitcase for an elderly woman. In other words, his Christ-inspired life was so deeply ingrained in him that he just naturally got off the train and began to look for somebody he could help. That was the way he was. But here's the real punchline of the story. Dr. McGilford said that as he reflected on this incident, watching Schweitzer help that woman with her suitcase, he was wishing, like everything, that he could find somebody whose luggage he could carry. See? It's the power of example. It's the power of influence. Schweitzer made those around him want to do good things. That's just the way he was, and that's the power of him. I think we might also all agree that maybe the best example of all was Christ. What features of Jesus' life were impressive and awesome? What features of his life were impressive and awesome by world standards? Well, it wasn't hardly anything that the world would say was impressive.
Turning water into wine.
Yeah.
Sandy, why didn't you come up with that?
I was over here snoozing.
But his influence over people was and is absolutely immeasurable. And it reminds us all of that famous piece written by the Reverend James Francis entitled One Solitary Life.
yeah, his
You've
life.
all heard
Oh,
that
yes.
before. And just to end this particular thought for the day, I think it's worth listening to it again in light of what we have talked about in terms of influencing and what other people were motivated to do because of who Jesus was. Okay? So here's a man who was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in this obscure town. He worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30 years old, and then for 3 years he was an itinerant teacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never owned a home. He never went to college. He never traveled anywhere except in his infancy, more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He never did one of those things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials of any kind except himself. While he was still young, the tide of popular opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them betrayed him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed upon a cross between two thieves. His executioners gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth, his seamless robe, and he was laid to rest in a borrowed grave. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the centerpiece of the human race. I am well within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever built, all the parliaments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man upon this earth as powerfully as this one solitary personality. Now that's the power of influence. And we are told that as Christians, we have an incredible power ourselves to influence other people around us. So maybe sometime we ought to think about just how we're doing in that regard of influencing other people. Now our second thought for the day kind of goes along with this. And I would ask you, first of all, this question. Have you ever felt that you were trapped in a cage? Is there anybody
one
here that
right
can
now.
say no to that? I mean, there have been times,
Free spirit.
because of what happens to us or events occurring around us, to our family or friends or whatever, that we feel trapped. We feel like we can't get out. It's never going to stop. It's not going to end. We can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. We're caught in this cage. We're imprisoned, and we cannot do what we want to do with our lives. We've all been there, I think. We've all
Doctor says
experienced
Xanax is good for that.
it. Or a glass of wine, Sandy.
Or both.
Yeah.
And we could all make our own little list of the kind of things that cause that kind of confinement and imprisonment in life, and it can be very, very difficult when we're caught in that kind of a trap. However, our second thought for the day is that a lot of the time when we are crammed into a cage or caught in a prison like that, it turns out to be a prison of our own making. We do it to ourselves. Listen to Paul's letter to the Romans from chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, and remember, Paul is writing this to the young Roman Christians. I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. In giving this advice to the church in Rome, Paul is presenting a very anti-Greek concept. This was an extremely foolish idea to the Greeks: present your bodies to God. And the reason for that is to the Greeks what mattered was the spirit. The body was unimportant. The body was only a prison house in which the spirit dwelled. The body was something actually to be ashamed of in a lot of instances. But Christian belief is that the body belongs to God just as much as the spirit. And so Paul is presenting here a concept that the Greek world would find very strange. But if your body is as much God's as the spirit, then that means that everything you do during your normal day, the way you act and the way you behave, everything you do becomes an act of worship, if that's the way you intend your life to be lived. Nevertheless, Paul says, we are not to be conformed to the world, but transformed from it. Do not allow yourself to become trapped or imprisoned by worldly things. If we are left to ourselves, we become dominated by our human nature. But if we are dominated by Christ, we are supposed to undergo this renewal, this change of mind, this inward transformation that enables us to break out of the prison of sin and self-centeredness. Well, our lesson writer, James Moore, says this: the great preacher W.E. Sangster, never heard of him, but anyway, he was a great preacher, tells of one day going to the zoo. And as he was exploring around, he came to a cage in which was this magnificent eagle. And he stood there for a while. He admired the powerful wings, the beautiful feathers. The whole animal was designed, was built for only one thing, and that's flying high in the sky. Beautiful creature. And if you've ever seen one of the bald eagles here flying around down at the lake, it's awesome. And as he stood there watching this beautiful eagle, somebody standing there nearby expressed his own feelings when he said, "Made for the skies and crammed in a cage." Well, there has to be a pretty powerful message in that for Christians. Are you thinking? And it brings a number of images to mind. Here you have the Apostle Paul writing to the Roman Christians and saying, don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. That's just another way of saying you were made for the skies. You were made to fly. So don't let the world cram you into a cage. He says, I think of Soren Kierkegaard, the respected Danish theologian, and his story of the wild duck flying south for winter. Now, the duck saw an abundant supply of corn in a barnyard. Duck swooped down, took a closer look, and decided, I'm just going to stop here and spend the whole winter here eating corn. In the spring, excuse me, when the other wild ducks flew back north, the wild duck tried to fly and join his friends, but he couldn't get off the ground. He was too fat, too tame, too domesticated, and he remained trapped in that barnyard, bored, imprisoned by his greed and laziness. He too was made for the skies, but he became caught in a cage of his own making. Think of Harry Emerson Fosdick, the famous pastor of Riverside Church in New York City. Now, I have heard of Fosdick. And he had a fascinating story about a vulture. He said it was a wintry day on the Niagara River below Buffalo, New York, when the vulture lighted on a carcass floating down the river and began to feed. He intended to feed until just before the falls, and then break away and fly to safety. But as he and the carcass moved swiftly toward the falls, he tried to fly away, but he couldn't. His claws had become frozen on this cold wintry day right to the carcass, and he plunged over the falls to his death. Well, he was made for the skies too, but he was crammed in a cage of his own doing. He meant to break free at the last moment and fly, live up to his potential, but his talons were frozen. He was imprisoned by the clutch of his claws. Sometimes our hands freeze tight to that which we feed upon. And although we are meant to soar much higher, we end up stuck in a cage with no way out. And we die. We take a quick look at a number of examples. If we are self-centered, okay, we are crammed into a cage of selfishness. It prevents us from being what we could be. It keeps us from being free and flying high. The idea is God has meant us to be, God has designed us to fly high to our potential. If we feed on defeat, we are stuck in the cage of negativism. If we are hooked on tranquilizers, alcohol, drugs, we're caught in the cage of escapism. If we always maintain the status quo, we are imprisoned in the cage of the closed mind. If we are jealous or resentful or hateful, we are trapped in the cage of hate. If we constantly talk about other people, we are shoved into the cage of
Gossip?
gossip. If we are anxiety-ridden, we end up in a cage of fear. Any of those cages, and believe me, we could sit here for an hour and list a whole lot more of them. Any of those cages and many others puts us on a course to take a fall. We've lost our freedom. We've lost our ability, our freedom to fly high in life and to do what we were meant to do. And here's what's really sad when you think about it. So many people will allow just one little thing to eclipse their entire life. You might have somebody that had 100 wonderful blessings happen in the past year, but one thing went wrong. One thing was bad and sour, and they allow that to eclipse everything, and they lock themselves in a cage. Things like prejudice, envy, bad temper, a worried spirit, nervous tension, hostility. I mean, gosh, there's all kinds of things. And you let just one thing ruin it all. Well, each one of us were created by God for the skies. You may find this hard to believe, my friends, but each one of you were meant for greatness. As far as God is concerned, you were meant and designed to soar high above life. I wonder if we ever look closely enough at ourselves to discover if we have created cages somehow that are keeping us from being what God has designed us to be or wants us to be. Well, if nothing else, it's certainly something to think about. I'm going to end this with a quote. It's a quote that my wife keeps right in the kitchen from somebody you may have heard about. Her name is Irma Bombeck. Irma is a Screech. But she said some very powerful and true things. And this is her quote. "When I stand before God at the end of my life, I would hope that I would not have a single bit of talent left. And I could say I used everything you gave me. In other words, she's saying, I would like to stand before God and say, I flew as high as you designed me to fly.
And she did.
And she did a pretty good job,
You
didn't
did.
she?
That's terrific.
And
Thank
use
you
all
very
this,
much, guys.
Oh,
and
thank
use
you,
all the
Warren.
saltiness